but the misconceptions around weight training and weightlifting for youth, right? It tends to be geared around like it might stunt growth, and in reality, meta-analysis looking at the effects of weightlifting training on jump ability and sprint performance tend to favor using weightlifting training, but that's in combination with why weightlifting has such a good transference, is because as we go from through specific phases of the lift or pre-season, right? So training on the pitch is lower, more time in the gym. So here is where you can use derivatives that really exploit high force loading, and you could use something like...
Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to a new episode of the Awareness Podcast. Today we're here with our guest, Shyam Chavda. Thank you very much for being with us, and introduce yourself to the people.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. So my name is Shyam Chavda. I'm a program lead for the Masters of Strength and Conditioning Distance Education at Middlesex University London Sport Institute. Outside of my academic role, I'm also the lead performance scientist at British Weightlifting, going into my third Olympic cycle with them in preparation for LA. And I'm also one of the national coaches for the team as well.
Okay, that's great. We're looking forward to speak to you. I mean, somebody that has so much experience, so much knowledge in this specific field that is weightlifting, and that so many young people have a lot of misconceptions around. So, I mean, of course, now you are into the weightlifting world on top of it, and you've also had the chance to work in different sports. So knowing that not a lot of people have a good idea of how weightlifting can be incorporated into their training and working in all these different sports, how does weightlifting itself helps an athlete perform in a better way? How does it make it a better athlete? What are some of the things about weightlifting that make an athlete better?
Yeah, so I think, jumping right into it without getting into the mechanical details, it's been quite a popular tool that's been used over the years, decades, I would say, to really help an athlete's expression of force within the weight room. Yeah. And its primary focus is around loading the triple extension pattern of the hip, knee, and the ankle. So it really works on that propulsive ability of an athlete. But it enables an athlete to do this with a good amount of load and at relatively moderate velocities. And that's why power outputs are so high with weightlifting, and impulse, which I can speak about later, is also very high in weightlifting. But I also think it has a secondary application as well, in that it's quite a complex movement. And I think introducing this, particularly at earlier developmental stages of an athlete's career, can help develop things like neuroplasticity and improve motor patterns moving forward. So what you've done is you end up creating a bigger toolbox for that athlete. So as they graduate throughout their athletic career, you've got more opportunities to create a change in whatever physical characteristic you are trying to make change to. Yeah. So I think that's probably one of the reasons. And it's also fun, right? It's not often you get a chance to put a heavy weight on a bar and try and throw it up in the air and essentially throw yourself under it in the simplest way possible.
Yeah. No, but I think that's a great way to put it, like throwing a bar up in the air and then putting yourself under it. I think is that a prompt that you give your athletes when they're doing it?
Not quite. Maybe it's an oversimplification of what weightlifting is. Okay. But it certainly teaches you a lot about yourself, and like you need to have courage.
Yeah.
To throw yourself under a bar that's heavy and it's coming back down to the ground, right?
Yeah.
But it also has the possibility of training other areas of the body, things like receiving the barbell, developing stiffness in the catch, discipline through positions and timing and execution and things like that begin to improve when you start to do weightlifting type movements.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it's really good, and also it's a really good way to magnify things like movement competency under load and speed as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, definitely. And
Yeah.
yeah, you mentioned two very interesting things that I want to talk about, which first one is triple extension, and then you also talked about impulse. But I want to start first with triple extension and how the fact that it allows you to do this movement at a very good velocity is one of the main benefits of weightlifting. What is that about triple extension? Why should every athlete should focus on mastering how to do this in a good way, able to perform better? And what is even triple extension? You mentioned ankle, knee, and hip, but like, what can you run us down through it a little bit, please?
Yeah, of course. So I think some of this comes to why we use the weightlifting movements, right? And it's around that concept of transference. So if you look at some of the old Soviet videos and Soviet training diaries, weightlifting movements were often used with track and field athletes and throwing athletes. And it's because of that transference of loading the triple extension pattern that could then be expressed within their sporting context. So what I mean by triple extension is it's a coordinated movement of the hip, the knee, and the ankle extending harmoniously to develop really high ground reaction forces, right? So if we go back to the concept of transference, the first thing you want to ask yourself with any exercise is going to be, does this exercise actually improve our ability to apply force in a way the sport demands us to? So if I take the example of sprinting, jumping, and even in throwing, the performance is constrained by impulse, and impulse is force times time. So technically, when we're sprinting, we have a very finite amount of time where we make contact with the floor, 100 milliseconds odd, let's say. So we can't increase the time that we spend on the ground, because if we do, then our opponents will be faster than us. So the other option is increase the force and the magnitude of force we produce during that time. So if you think of impulse in a force time curve, we don't want long, low, and fat. We want tall and thin. And tall and thin means we're producing high amounts of force in the time frame we have available to apply it.
Okay.
So that's why weightlifting has such a good transference, is because as we go from through specific phases of the lift, we have a finite amount of time governed by the technique, and we have to accelerate the entire system, so our body and the barbell, with incredible amounts of force, right? And we have a very short amount of time to produce that. So that's why weightlifting often gets used for non-weightlifting specific training. So it's team sport training, field-based training.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Were you gonna say something, Matt?
I think there's a YouTube video about sprint analysis, and they show that everyone, like every sprinter or like amateur sprinter, they spend the same time in the air, but then like that's why it's so important to use the impulse and produce the most force when you're on the ground. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. They even use I think they even use older people, so like a grandma is almost the same time in there as using Bolt. Bolt was 20 times more power in there. Yeah. So okay. So it allows you to, for considering that the time is constrained and that's not variable, it allows you to work on that force component inside of impulse, and then as weightlifting works specifically on that, that's why it's so transferable to other sports, right?
Yeah, I also think that we can take a much deeper dive into that, right, behind the mechanisms.
Let's do it, yeah.
That's not to say just do weightlifting and your sprint performance on the field is going to improve. It's far away from what I'm trying to say. But it's more about the first principles and the mechanisms that relate to the physics behind how our body moves and the biomechanics behind how the body moves generates force within the context of the sporting movement, right? So let's say, for example, we think of it as, let's just say, rate of force development, right? Really steep and high, right? Sprinting and jumping happens in a very short amount of time. Ground contact times are short, therefore we have to produce lots of force in the time we have available. Right? We don't have time where we can gradually build that force. We need to do it quick. If you're going off the blocks, it's a different story. You've got a bit more time, right? Because you've got longer contacts on the floor, for example. But when you look at the meta-analysis research that has been done, so a meta-analysis is statistical analysis that's been run on a series of peer-reviewed journals and papers that look at whether a specific type of training type has a benefit relative to another one, for example. So meta-analysis looking at the effects of weightlifting training on jump ability and sprint performance tend to favor using weightlifting training, but that's in combination with traditional resistance training, things like squats, deadlifts, RDLs, but even more so when it's coupled with plyometric training, because plyometric training, short ground contact times, you're training other physiological mechanisms such as the stretch reflex, right?
Okay. So the meta-analysis favors the integration of these three training methodologies, yeah? Okay.
Over using just traditional resistance training.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I understand. And Shyam, I mean, I think you're touching on a very important point on how to implement it. But before that, I want to set the tone for everybody watching that may have some misconceptions about weightlifting. What are some of the most common misconceptions that you hear, or some of the things that people may believe to be true or may believe about weight training, but that they're actually not? And in this way, we can like frame it and set the tone so people, when it comes a time of knowing how to implement it, already had their minds and acknowledge how this can be something that can benefit them.
Yeah, so I'll take two kind of perspectives from it. I'll go with training like adults, and then maybe speak a little bit about youth and younger athletes. So I think with adults, often or not, the barrier is they maybe haven't been exposed to it early enough. So the movement is quite difficult to develop, especially if you're including catching derivatives, because unless you have a good amount of mobility and flexibility, catching can be quite difficult. And also your body's developed a protective mechanism where maybe it doesn't want to drop under a barbell that's coming down onto you. So, you know, that tends to be a barrier from what I see. And that's why you often see power cleans done as opposed to like a full squat clean or a full squat snatch.
Okay.
I also think coaches may find it difficult to coach.
Okay.
It's at what point is it good enough to elicit the adaptation that you are chasing, versus at what point do you go, no, we need to keep working on technique, because then you take away from the training program a little bit and you take away from the time you could have used to use another exercise and create the physical adaptation that you intended to, right?
Definitely.
So it's a tough balance. And we've written a paper some years back on a way to analyze weightlifting movements, but also we termed them stable and variable components. And these stable components are things which, if you achieve them, the lift is probably going to be good enough. And it means you're able to do it safely, most importantly, but also effectively to a point where you can load it and can get some adaptation.
I see. So that minimum point in which you can do it and start loading it and still is going to yield benefits.
Absolutely. And it gives a coach a bit of a crib sheet to identify, okay, what part of the lift is breaking down? What do I need to focus on as a coach? It kind of hones in for a coach where to focus. And we actually developed, so myself and the performance manager at British Weightlifting, Stuart Martin, we developed a bit of a marking criteria, which is available on Anthony Turner, our Professor Anthony Turner, his website, which is the fitness formula.
Okay.
And there's a grading criteria for each phase of the lift. So when you record it and watch it on your phone, you can go through it and identify, okay, this is the part I need to work on.
Yeah, exactly. Shit that gives you a visual on, okay, this he's has all the checks. We're able to load it. Okay. So in terms of adults, if I understand correctly, it's mostly the fact that they haven't been exposed to those movements yet. They don't have that movement literacy per se to perform those movements. So you have to kind of like focus a little bit more of time on working on the techniques. And let's say an adult perhaps doesn't have that long-term vision that maybe you can have with a younger athlete, right? So how do you work around this and put focus into the technique while still making sure that you're training so the athlete or the person can still adapt?
Yeah, I think it's important to reinstate, when you look at the literature on lift derivatives, so where you take the catch out, it becomes way more accessible, right? So that's where you can implement it with adults who maybe don't want to, don't need to catch. Maybe your philosophy is you don't need to be catching a clean or catching a snatch. It doesn't matter. We do jump shrug, we do mid thigh pull, we do hang pulls. You can do those variations and get a very good adaptation on what you're trying to create adaptation for.
Yeah.
With youth, I think you've got a longer period of time, right? You've got to think, like, what is your purpose at that time point in that athlete's journey? And the earlier it is, of course, it's around movement competency. So when you look at the research on youth development, we want to expose them at a young age to lots of different movement patterns and movement types. So that develops neuroplasticity. So they have a greater affinity to learn new skills as they begin to get older.
Mm-hmm.
But they also have a better competency as they tend to get older, right?
Yeah, exactly. So they have like a stronger foundation that then allows them to do many different movements, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the things where I believe this barrier has certainly been broken down over the last decade or so, for sure. But the misconceptions around weight training and weightlifting for youth, right? It tends to be geared around, like, it might stunt growth. And in reality, supervised resistance training doesn't actually cause any harm. And when it's done correctly with appropriate loading, technique, and progression, you can actually get a really good benefit, physiological and psychological benefit from that. And you can also get greater bone density as well because of the loading. So if it's done and done well and done safely, then it only adds to that youth athlete's development as they grow. But also the thought is, well, why am I doing weightlift? It's really dangerous. Like, I'm throwing a weight up and I'm catching it, and it just looks dangerous. But when you look at sports played by youth, it's actually the opposite. So many of the sports, things like football, rugby, gymnastics, have really high injury rates in comparison to weight training.
Yeah.
But that's because there's contact, there's non-contact injuries, it's uncontrolled environments. And the guy who got me into weightlifting, the late Brian Hamill, he did a study very long time ago on British schools, and he found that weightlifting had a really low injury rate per hour compared to traditional team-based sports for those reasons, right?
No, that's great. I mean, the fact that it's per hour I mean, because weightlifting is done at a lower scale than, let's say, these other sports. But when you measure it per hour, it allows you to actually level them up. And I mean, what you're saying is true. And a lot of people tend to think in extremes, but they don't realize that everything has a learning curve. So, of course, you're not going to go and do a heavy snatch all of a sudden. You have to go through the learning for it. You have to do the right progressions. But then it's what you're saying is like, I find it so interesting because the fact that it stunts your growth is not only not right, is the opposite from the truth. Like, it
Yeah,
actually helps your growth when done correctly. So
exactly.
now that you mentioned that component of doing it correctly, let's talk a little bit about that. Like, how does a young athlete get into weightlifting? What are the main stepping stones, and then how do you start progressing them?
I think the main stepping stone is making sure you have a credible coach.
Mm,
That's the first thing. And whether you're talking about weightlifting for weightlifting's the sake of weightlifting as a sport
yeah.
is one thing. So in the UK, I think under 13, if you compete in weightlifting, it's not solely based on the load you lift, but actually a point system on technique,
Oh, really?
which is great because what
Yeah.
it does, it controls the safety a bit better and also instills that technique is just as important as the weight you lift. We're in this long-term journey, not a short-term gain. So yeah, finding a credible coach, and not putting on the weight on the bar quicker than your development, right?
Yeah.
So it's a gradual process, and I think finding fun in doing it is also very important,
Yeah.
because if you're doing it to get into the sport of weightlifting, as much as it's a strength and power sport, the long term is definitely a game of endurance. Who
Yeah.
can last the longest, train the longest without injury? When I mean the
Mm,
longest, I'm talking over the decade or so,
yeah.
10 years or so. They're the ones that really make the big progress.
Yeah, because people might think, "Oh, I've been training for 3 years. I'm already advanced," but there's always levels to it. And Shyam, you mentioned how to start with you mentioned how starting, let's say, with a good coach is very important, and you mentioned how it changes depending if you are into weightlifting as a sport, and then also if you're an athlete. Let's do both scenarios, right? So if you're in weightlifting as a sport, where would you start? Like, what are some of the exercises that you have to master first, or some of the movement patterns that you have to master first before you start progressing? And then we can do, let's say, for a normal athlete playing other sports.
Yeah, so different nations teach differently. I'll go through the way we've traditionally taught it here and the
Okay.
rationale behind why. So
Mhm.
if you want to learn the whole movement, so including the catch, we'd take a what we call a reverse chain approach. Reverse chain approach essentially teaches you the catch position downwards. So
Okay.
let's take a clean. So
Mhm.
front squat would be the first thing, right? Is someone competent in doing a front squat?
Mm.
Because if they are, we know they can get into the catch position, right?
Yeah.
If they aren't, then we've got some mobility issues to address, because we don't want them to throw themselves under a bar at speed with that, or with poor mobility. So that's almost used as a screening tool.
Okay.
Then from there we can go, okay, how do we get the bar to a point where we need to front squat? So
Okay.
this is now the turnover. So
I
we
see.
might do something like tall clean drops, where we hold the bar maybe at around the sternum or belly button. We stand in triple extension. So this is the end of our second pull.
Mm-hmm.
And we drop into a front squat as quickly as we can.
Okay.
That might just be a training bar.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But just to train the movement.
Train the movement, but train your body's ability to drop under the barbell.
Okay.
get it in the front squat. So if you look at those two exercises which I've spoken about, the difference is a front squat is controlled and slow.
Mm-hmm.
A tall clean drop where you're in triple extension, the bar's at around belly button to the sternum roughly, and you're dropping into a front squat, right? All of a sudden, we've added an element of speed.
Yeah.
So your body will take the least path of resistance. So you will not have time to get into a comfortable front squat position. Your body will go, I know I need to get into a front squat position, and I know I need to do it fast. So this is where you notice people's feet position from their front squat. All of a sudden, you add speed. It goes out wider. It turns out more. Elbows drop. So
Yeah.
you might be able to front squat when we control it and it's slow and it's easy. But when we add speed, all sorts of things are going on. So let's now fix how you catch the bar. So you're safe and you're also in the strongest position.
Yeah, but as you already know how to front squat by itself, it's gonna be, I imagine it's gonna be smoother to do that process of learning how to front squat with speed, right?
Of course, because you're just dropping into a front squat. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
When often beginners come in, what do you think they're lacking the most? Of course, the technique, but also like you talked about mobility, or like body awareness,
or all of the above.
all of it, okay.
All of the above generally, right? But it's important, like when you start prescribing exercises to beginners, like you might notice have a really bad, let's say really bad mobility generally. You don't want them to get bored by just doing mobility stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So introducing exercises and getting them to feel what's uncomfortable and then getting them to feel what is comfortable after they improve their mobility, they start to get a bit more of a buy into the process.
Mm-hmm.
So sorry, kind of going back to the original question around teaching the progression. So now we've dropped into a front squat.
Mm-hmm.
We can now focus on the part which is exploited the most, because this is where we can get our adaptation. So there are variations of this. So I'll just give you a few. So you might do like a mid-thigh or a power position. I prefer the term power position. Power position pull, or power position clean. You might drop it lower to a hang pull or a hang clean, which is at the end of first pull. So this is now training that triple extension pattern. If you put the catch out and just do the pull, you can stay there and make some really good benefit for field sports.
Okay, I understand. And after you get to that point, because now I have the doubt, after you get to that point, is that where most of the force is generated, by the way?
Correct, yeah, as you go into the second pull.
Okay, so let's say when you're training how to do this movement, like the whole movement, do you actually perform a lot of force, let's say, in the other phases of the movement, or is most of it coming from the beginning and the rest is just like following the movement? Like, I'm just trying to understand how does it work in the mind of the weightlifter?
Sure. So there's two things at play here, right? When you're going off the floor, the first thing is overcoming the barbell's inertia, right?
Yeah.
So we have to create a force efficient enough that surpasses the barbell's load for us to begin to accelerate it.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at the impulse of the first pull, so the bar from the floor to around the top of the knee, where the knee becomes that first peak knee extension, it's short and fat, because you have time to develop that force as you lift it off the floor. But the reason that is also the case is because it allows you to maintain specific positions of the body that can help you express force at more critical points of the lift.
Okay. Yeah.
So when we get to the knee, the force actually, as we transition through the bar, so the knees feed through the bar, force decreases because we're repositioning our knee under the bar. So we're not putting as much vertical force down.
Okay.
Just
Okay.
drop off a little bit.
Yeah.
And then when we're as we get into that power position, that's where it starts to increase as we move into triple extension.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
And the way we can produce this force throughout the lift is determined by our interaction between our body center of mass, the center of pressure we apply into the floor, and the barbell center of mass. We keep these things close to each other, we can express our force far better with less energy leaks.
Okay. Okay. I understand now. So with somebody that's getting into weightlifting, you do this reverse approach, and when you first start with a catch, then you go through the other movement, and then you finish off with the one that ends up giving you like where you can exploit the most, as you mentioned. And,
Yeah,
and is that the last phase that you work on, or is there anything else afterwards?
No, so once we've done some stuff at the knee, there's lots of other derivatives at the knee, by the way. You could do it from a block, you could do hang, you can do hang with a counter movement. So now you're utilizing the stretch reflex. So again, impulse would once again increase because stretch shortening cycle being used. You then go down to the floor. So now you're in the set position. And I think this is massively overlooked. The set position is incredibly important because it's where we have the most time to comfortably get ourselves into a position where we're ready to lift a heavy load, right? And there's no time constraint there. That's where we're in control. So making sure the bar's over our base of support, which tends to be that first shoelace where we're applying that center of pressure. Then also our shoulders being slightly in front of the bar. So if you drew a line between the armpit crease, the bar should be in a line at the very least, right?
Okay.
This allows us to maintain a really strong pull off the floor because the initiation of the pull off the floor comes from the legs. And this is really important for how it transfers into the second pull, because our torso, so our body, when we lift the bar off the floor, our torso should stay at the same angle, similar angle.
Okay.
Which means the primary mover is our lower body, it's our legs.
Yeah.
And it's the knee joint which is extending. So if our torso is the same and our knee joint extends, our hamstrings and our rec fem, which are biarticular muscles, will go under a stretch. And now as we get to the end of the first pull, which is in that hang position, when we move through the transition phase into second pull, we're now utilizing the stretch reflex to complement the output during the second pull.
Okay. And when you're in that beginning phase of you're just trying to get it off the floor, you mentioned how you have all the time, right? You don't have any time constraint, but still, do you want that movement of trying to get it off the floor to be violent, or is that something that doesn't necessarily have to be done in a very fast pace?
No, it doesn't need to be done in a fast pace. The way I like to look at it is like a gear stick in a car. You know, you build the speed up almost, right?
Okay.
And the reason you don't want to rip the barbell from the floor is because you'll accelerate it and then you'll have to slow down again anyway as you get to the knee for the knee to come through. So what happens with the force goes up, it drops a lot, and then you have to re-accelerate. That costs a lot of energy.
Yeah.
So the balance is between the technique and the force that you're producing from the first pull.
I understand. Okay.
A number of papers. So one of our PhD students, Dr. Angela Sorensen, her first study she published found that clean performance is heavily dictated by the impulse produced in the first pull.
Okay.
If you look at more recent research using isometrics from the first pull, it's one of the biggest predictors of weightlifting performance. which Sean Joff has presented in his research.
Right.
So it's important, but there's a trade-off. If you want to be patient but strong to hold your position, and as you come through that knee, that's where your knees feed through and you violently almost jump with the bar, using simple terms.
Okay, I understand. And Sham, that's basically like, of course, in a nutshell, some of the things that you try to look at when you're dealing with an athlete that's actually focused on weightlifting. But let's say, and I don't know if you do this too often now, but from your time in other sports or just based on your knowledge, how would you progress this as well? Let's say for somebody that's also training for a different sport, like, or at least some of the fundamentals that they should look at, so they can at least expose themselves to the benefits of weightlifting while still training for their different sports.
Yeah, it's a good question, and one I'm often asked. I think it depends on the context and the sport. So I'll give you a couple of scenarios.
Yeah.
The first thing is, why, going back to one of the first questions, which I kind of led with, was why are you using the weightlifting derivatives in the first place? And in the context of sport and team-based sport, field-based sport, it's going to be to drive a specific adaptation. So what is that adaptation? Let's say you're in a strength block and you're a rugby player and you're off season or pre-season, right? So training on the pitch is lower, more time in the gym. So here is where you can use derivatives that really exploit high force loading. And you could use something like mid-thigh pulls, which will be from a dead stop. And you might want to use something between 120 to 140% of one repetition maximum. And the reason you can use supramaximal loads is because it's a partial movement.
Yeah. So 140 from the whole movement rep mats. Yeah.
Of the whole movement rep mats,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
Providing you have that, right?
Yeah.
If you don't, you could just keep loading the bar. 140% is a lot and it moves very slow, but because it's so heavy, high force outputs. The lower end of that, around 120, higher impulse, because it's light enough for you to move relatively quickly and you're still producing a hell of a lot of force as well.
Is a relationship between the time in which you move it and the force that you move it with, right?
Force and time.
Okay.
Now, you could also do, if you wanted to lift from the floor or do pulls from the floor later on in the season, then maybe this would be a good opportunity to do something like a halted pull. So where it's like a deadlift, but it's not quite a deadlift. So it's doing the first pull only from the floor, right?
Right.
And what that does, it develops a positional strength and a lot of posterior strength as well.
Okay. So that could be a good starting point of doing the one that you start from the mid thigh and then doing the one that you do like the first pull. Yeah, those could be two movements that an athlete starting out can look into.
Absolutely, and there's nothing stopping them from doing a clean pull, right? You could do the pull from the floor because again, you can use supramaximal loads up to about 110%, but do they have the correct positions to be able to hold so they're getting the most out of that clean pull movement? Maybe not at this stage, right?
Yeah.
Then let's say you go into season and now the focus becomes about maintaining force output but more power, but also they're running more, they're getting more contacts on the shoulder. So based on that, do you want them to be catching? If someone can power clean but they're making 50 tackles a game and their shoulders are a bit sore, you probably don't want more impact on the shoulder, right?
Definitely.
So you could now change that mid-thigh pull into something like a jump shrug, where you go very light load, 35-40% of the max,
Okay.
and jump as high as you can. High velocity movement, really big power output because of the velocity side of things, not because of the force side of things.
How's that one called again?
Jump shrug.
Jump truck. And what, like, how does that one move? No, look, sorry, exactly. Because I can
Same
put.
as a mid-thigh pull.
Sorry.
Same as a mid-thigh pull, but you just jump.
Oh, okay. So jumping.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, you also have to maintain force. So another way is doing like a hang pull with a counter movement.
Okay.
And that's something you can load relatively heavy. I think anywhere between 80 to like 100%, and that will take care of the force element of the force velocity curve. So you've kind of trained across that force velocity curve using just a couple of exercises, but you've also considered the context of the sport, i.e. not doing a catch because of the shoulder. You may not want to do counter movement. You might just do from the block because they're doing lots of running. So nervous system's a bit fried. So maybe don't do counter movement. So the context really drives the exercises you will select.
Definitely.
And talking about the context of the sport, you see a lot of football players doing like box squats, because then they say like, of course, you never start in such a low position as if you do like a deep squat. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so things like box squats, quarter squats would all have their place depending on the time of the season, right? I think sprinters are a really good example of it because it's very specific to the demand of their sport. So in a pre-season, they may do full squats. It's far more taxing because you're mechanically doing more work because you're displacing the bar a lot more. You're displacing your center of mass a lot more. Whereas when you start coming into maintenance of strength and trying to convert that force into high power outputs, you can go partial, you can overload a partial movement. It's not going to fatigue you as much. And you're almost kind of exploiting that really high force characteristic in a very specific range that is relevant to the demand of the sport.
Definitely. And I think, as you mentioned, it really comes down to what is the specific adaptation that you want to achieve? Like, what's the goal of your sport? And then, as of course, let's say in season, you have less time and you have to be more efficient with your training. Maybe looking to load those parts of the movement and those types of movements that are going to relate more to what you're going to do in your sport, right? So as you've mentioned, like there are different movements, so different partials that you can do that are going to give you the benefits and the adaptations that you're looking for, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. And Shyam, I keep saying Shyam,
It's
but
okay.
you mentioned how the best result comes from doing the weightlifting. I mean, yeah, the best result compared to just doing conventional lifting alone comes from doing weightlifting, plyometric, and resistance. How would you, let's say, in a week of an athlete, of course, it depends on the moment of the season, but let's say they're in off season and they have all the availability to train. How would you distribute these different training techniques or training types in order to get the best benefit?
Yeah, I think that's it's a fully loaded question. There's lots of different ways of doing it, but I think simple is best. One, let's just say they do 3 gym sessions in a week. Have a strength-based exercise based on the fact you said they're off season. Have a strength-based exercise, something like trap bar deadlift, squat of some sort. Have you could possibly theme each of those days if you wanted. You know, you could have say a contrast type training, so you could do your squat, some form of jump, and then some unilateral accessory type work as well. Second day could be more high force power orientated, so that could be things like your clean pulls. It could be again, some throw type exercise because it's more power orientated. And then your third day might be a combined type session where you do, again, another moderate to heavy strength-based exercise. You could also do maybe something like a power clean, and then you could do something like a plyometric type exercise.
Okay.
Depending on, the goal, you could flip it over and do the power clean first when you're most fresh. So your power output's going to be higher, and then your squats, and then some sort of plyometric type exercise.
And
So
and how
doing it for sure.
how would you determine, because I think that last point is interesting, of how do you determine whether you should place the weightlifting exercise first or the resistance training exercise first? Of course, like depending on what the actual outcome you want to get is, but how do we know that like what exercise to load the most and load first?
Yeah, I think there's two answers to that. The first one is, if they're learning something new, put that new thing in first while they have the brain capacity for it and they're not tired, right? So there could be some technical work dedicated to weightlifting, and then you just do your normal traditional type strength training and plyometrics. Yep.
Yeah.
Still get very good benefits from it. If, however, you're in a power block of training and the emphasis is power, of course, you're going to be putting your power-based exercise first so you can exploit that as much as possible. Whereas if it's a strength-based training block, flip it over. And that's going to be dependent on the type of monitoring that you do and the diagnostics that you do to determine whether they need to be doing more high force strength type training or more power based type training.
I understand. And Shyam, this is kind of a selfish question, but I wanted because I'm coming off an injury, right? So I got knee surgery in January, but now based on what you're saying, I'm really interested on starting to get a little bit more into weightlifting. But I wanted to, of course, I know this is a very nuanced question and it really depends on the nature of the injury. But just if you had any type of, like, I don't know, examples that you've had before of somebody that had an injury and still was able to like do the weightlifting training in a good way, or if there's any contraindication in that. Do you have any scenario like that?
Yes, again, a fully loaded question for me there. I think the first thing is obviously having medical clearance on knowing what you can and can't do.
Definitely.
That's the most important thing. Health and safety is going to be a priority in this instance. Then it will be the clearance from physio. So they will be able to determine whether you can introduce certain loading, certain velocities around that knee joint. And that really then will determine what you should and shouldn't be doing. I can give you a couple of examples where maybe you start with like slower, more controlled strength-based exercises, isometrics. So you've still have high force output, but not as much joint articulation or no joint articulation in isometrics.
And are these isometrics that you're talking about, isometrics of just any movement like an isometric squat, or are those isometric of movements or of positions that you're specifically going to have, let's say, in a lift?
A general isometric, so around the knee, whether it's isolated knee joint extension, flexion, or whether it's multi-joint isometric like the squat or a pull. Right. And then I think it's essentially a case of seeing what derivative you can do without causing pain or inflammation or a flare-up. And then it's about structured loading from there. And then I suppose it's really important in this instance where the strength and conditioning coach and the physio work very closely together to monitor and manage the outcome of that training session on the knee. And it might be a case, and I touch wood, this isn't the case for you, But let's say someone has a surgery on their knee and now they can't go into full knee flexion.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe now you won't be able to do, or that person won't be able to do a full clean, but they can do a power clean.
Okay.
Fantastic. Maybe they don't feel confident they can do a power clean. That's fine. Just do mid-thigh clean pull. Do some counter movement hang pulls. You're still going to train that propulsive element of the weightlifting movement, which is of course used for sport performance.
Okay. So because I didn't know how to ask the question in a way, because I know how it covers, like there's a lot of different things, but you answered it perfectly, especially now at the end of like you can still, even though you have contraindications or things that don't allow you to do certain things, you can still do those partials that you've been talking about, which is an idea that it really has stuck with me, and still get some of the benefit that weightlifting gives to you, right? That propulsion benefit that it gives to you, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Perfect.
I wanted to ask something about the training structure we talked about before. What do you think about what's it called? Shit, now I forgot the word. It's if you do squats and then you do squat jumps.
I like contrast complex training. Yeah, really good. There's some really good literature supporting its use. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing more to say. It's also very time efficient as well, and I think that becomes really important with the limited amount of time strength and conditioning coaches have with the athletes in the gym. And I also think, like, one of the things I've missed out, which is really important, that other exercises don't allow an athlete to do, is the intent in weightlifting is maximal, right? Especially the heavier the load gets. So there was a really good study on weightlifters. I can't remember the name of who did it, but they went to about 100% of a power clean. And what happened past, I think, 80%, maybe 90%, power output started to increase with the full lift in comparison to a partial or a derivative. And the reason being is because they have to really fully propel themselves up, right? And the intention of moving fast is forced when you're doing weightlifting, particularly if you're catching, particularly if the loads are heavy enough.
Yeah.
So that's something, for example, if you do that with a squat, you spend a large proportion of the time decelerating in the movement.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So doing something heavy in a squat with full intent of movement, really beneficial, but it'll have to be quite heavy, 80% plus. Then doing a jump where your intention means you're leaving the floor, fantastic. Two ends of the spectrum on the force velocity, load velocity curve, right? Weightlifting sits right in that middle.
Okay. And I mean, because as you mentioned, like when you, let's say I'm doing a bench press, I can just go through the motions and do it slowly. While if I'm doing a full weightlifting movement, it's like I have to do it fast. There's no other way around it, right? It's not like I can slowly bring the weight here and then put it here. It has to be done fastly, right?
Correct.
Yeah, no, I think that's very important. And I mean, I can talk about, because for me, a lot of these concepts are very new because again, like as athletes, we don't get taught about this much, and we don't get exposed to this as much, let's say, in it when we do weight training with the team. Of course, it depends on what team you're playing and everything, and the philosophy that they have. But at least in my end, I wasn't exposed to these types of concepts early on, and I think they're very important because, as you mentioned, it really resembles like what you're doing in a sport, which is you're constrained by the amount of time that you have of that ground contact time, but then it allows you to increase that force that you're producing. So it really transfers well to what you will receive in a sport. So again, I just think all these concepts that you talk about are very important. And then it also gives a lot of clarity around it as you're explaining. You don't have to start off by doing the whole movement and doing it perfectly. You can do partials. You can do different things that still give you the benefit that you're looking for, but don't require, let's say that technical ability that doing a full movement may require. So you just gave a lot of access to a lot of people to say, okay, I can still do this and I don't have to be an expert at it and I can still get the benefits from it. So I think what you just mentioned is very important, and I do appreciate you sharing all these insights, because I think it certainly they gave me a lot of clarity. Matse, do you have anything else, brother, before we go to the rapid fire?
That was very interesting. And I think at the start you said it like weightlifting is just another toolbox, or like to make your toolbox bigger to enhance your performance. I think that's the right way to say it, because the best thing about strength training, you can just do it so specific. Like you just said with Camilo, when he has an injury, you can do certain movements to keep training. And we talked about like beginners, and you said like, of course, there's people who can have a personal trainer or like going somewhere. I was like exposed. We went to what's it called? CrossFit gym with the team. I think it was perfect. But if there's someone at home and doesn't have a personal trainer, what is like the, let's say, 3 movements who are safe to do? Of course, not it's always safe, but the safest to do if he wants to start with weightlifting.
Oh, safest one. Do I need to sign a disclaimer for this? I think if I could maybe cheekily reframe that a little bit, instead of saying safest, I'd say probably the most beneficial to transfer to other gym movements and also to weightlifting. It would be some form of squat pattern. So overhead squat is always a very good way to train mobility, strength, and stability. Romanian deadlift, so learning to hip hinge appropriately and to fix the torso and to make sure you have a rigid trunk. And a third one, I would probably say maybe something either, I think something relatively simple, maybe something like a push-up, for example. Like the upper body often gets forgotten about, but if you think about a push-up, again, the ability to hold your trunk in a neutral position, and when you push up, have control of your scapula on the way down, and actually be able to maintain a position with the elbows, I think is really, really good. And I know there's a lot of academies which would have like fundamental competency requirements for youth athletes. I think that's fine for any beginner looking to start lifting weights. There'll be a hip hinge, there'll be a squat, there might be a lunge, a push, and a pull.
Amazing.
So there's 5 there. You've constrained me to 3, but I hope
that's good.
I hope
there's like exercises which have like the least amount of doing something wrong. But like I say, if you're beginner training at home, you wouldn't do like a snatch or something.
Yeah.
Amazing. Shyam, how about we do some rapid fire questions just to finish it off?
Wonderful. Of course.
Perfect. So, I mean, you answered already this one. Like, the first one was mainly around if it would stunt the growth of an athlete, but you just mentioned that it's actually the opposite from the true when done correctly. So let's go. Why is a heavy front squat a good core exercise?
Why is a heavy front squat a good core exercise? Because the load is in front of you, as opposed to directly over your center of mass when it's on the back, where you can flex. So if it's in front, you aren't able to flex forward, so you have to maintain an upright posture. So that's why it's a good trunk-based exercise.
Perfect.
For a young athlete, why is it better to train free weight than machines?
Motor pattern, coordination development, but that's not to disregard machine-based weight training either. I think it definitely has its place, particularly if some movements take a long time to learn or the athlete's development's not as quick as you want it to be. Why not put them on a leg press?
Definitely. And Shyam, if an athlete isn't sore the next day, did they fail at training?
No. No.
So it's okay to not be sore the next day.
Okay to not be sore the next day. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, you're in the elevator with a skeptical parent. Why should their kids start lifting weights today?
That's a really good question, because strength is essentially foundation of life. It doesn't only develop physical capacities and abilities, but also social, psychological capacities as well. And more and more research is starting to show like life longevity with those who are stronger, and stronger people are just generally more resilient.
Yeah.
I'm convinced.
You can literally just say, "Do you want your kid to live more?" And there you go. And Shyam, just to finish it off, if you can give one piece of advice to young athletes, which one would it be?
Train smart. You're a young athlete, got a lot of time ahead of you, so train smart and find the joy in training, find the fun, and find out what keeps you going back.
Perfect. The long run, whoever stays the longest wins, right?
Generally
Perfect.
tends to be the case.
As I said before, I really appreciate you just sharing the insights, and I'm so happy that we finally got the chance to speak, because this was definitely something, as I told you before, that I was looking forward to. Again, because I haven't been exposed to this type of weightlifting knowledge, and it really gives me an idea of how I can start using it and how important it is to implement it in my training protocols to be able to perform at my fullest. And how is it not only just weightlifting, but then also the complementing it with these other training modalities. But you really gave me a lot of clarity in this, and I hope everybody watching it also got the same result. So again, man, I truly appreciate it, and looking forward to speak again anytime soon.
Yes, thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure.
Likewise, Matt Camillo, thank you very much for having me on. It was an honor, and yeah, it was good fun.